Next to the stage, National Endowment for Democracy board member Will Dobson.
Good morning. My name is Will Dobson, and I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, not actually a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy, so one correction at the bat. It's my distinct pleasure to join you this morning to moderate our panel, Countering the Dictators' Playbook. Now, I'm going to ask you to start to just take a moment to put yourself in the shoes of a dictator. Imagine across your country there are groups, networked and organized, with the ability to mobilize people through volunteering, advocacy, and social justice. Imagine that they seek to foster a sense of community, bridging social divides, all while being guided by a moral compass higher than any political authority. These groups stand at the ready to speak out for minority rights, and they serve as a counterweight to government power. Now, I don't ask you to see it from this perspective as some sort of call for empathy. Rather, it's important that we realize and we understand that this is how tyrants and dictators see people of faith. So it should come as no surprise that they have historically and consistently seen religious freedom as a threat to their rule. And they're right. Religious freedom is fundamental to democracy because it so often promotes core democratic values such as individual freedom, equality, tolerance, and civic engagement. The protection of religious freedom is a cornerstone of a democratic society, allowing for diverse beliefs to coexist peacefully within a system of checks and balances. Since World War II, more than half of the 180 nonviolent campaigns for major political change have been rooted in religion. We stand at a consequential moment. From China and Iran to Russia, North Korea, and Nicaragua, we're witnessing the profound rise of authoritarian adversaries who worked together to challenge liberal democracy. What is more, we are witnessing how modern dictatorships are growing more sophisticated in how they mete out repression, both within their borders and beyond. Tools that we once hoped might spark democracy's advance are being repurposed and weaponized against freedom itself. With this panel this morning, we take up the challenge of countering the dictator's playbook. Our panelists will share some of the newest tools that authoritarian regimes are using to limit religious freedom and offer insight into how we can fight back. Because even in countries of immense oppression, there are brave individuals fighting for the freedom to think, speak, and worship without fear. Now today we are fortunate to be joined by three brave individuals who are at the forefront of this struggle. Felix Maradiaga is the president of the Latin American Liberal Network, a member of the World Liberty Congress, and a senior fellow at both the University of Virginia and Florida International University. While a candidate in the 2021 Nicaraguan presidential election, he was arrested and held prisoner by President Daniel Ortega's regime, which stripped him of his Nicaraguan nationality and deported him upon his release. Oleksandra Matviichuk is a human rights defender who works on issues in Ukraine and the OSCE region. She heads the human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties, which has been at the forefront of documenting Russia's grievous crimes across Ukraine and was awarded the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize. And lastly, Dr. Adrian Zenz is a senior fellow and director of China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. His research focus is on China's ethnic policy and Beijing's campaign of mass internment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. He has played a leading role in the analysis of leaked Chinese government documents, including the China cables, the Xinjiang papers, and the Xinjiang police files. Please join me in welcoming this morning's panel. Now, we want to begin by setting the stage with really the challenge that's ahead of us, the challenge that we face. And what's wonderful about this panel is that we have three people with very different areas of work, very different areas of expertise, and different regions in which you focus primarily. So it's an opportunity to present a global perspective. And so perhaps maybe we'll start with you, Felix. If you could give us a sense of sort of what are the new tools that you witness in your work that authoritarians are using to limit religious freedom?
Thank you, Will, and thank you, everyone, for attending this panel. They're just a combination of all tactics. So as we know, attacks on religious freedom has been since the beginning that humans have been having organized religion, but they combine new tactics, as we call them, Dictators 2.0, using surveillance, technology, to, for example, use financial repression. In the case of Nicaragua, they had been accessing information of religious institutions by accessing privileged information of the dioceses in Nicaragua. The case of my own diocese in Matagalpa with Bishop Alvarez, for example, was accused of money laundering. The same thing with the diocese of Managua. But at the same time, they have been using a narrative, creating distortions of faith, in the sense that the regime, for example, has been using, particularly with the now co-dictator Rosario Murillo, the constitution in Nicaragua has been completely changed to create something called the co-presidency, in which she argues that the Catholic conference are not true Christians. They're not providing the true Christian message. So this combination of all tactics of arbitrary detention, torture, persecution, seizing of assets is combined with new tactics using technology, and also using a narrative that also sounds religious, in a way to claim that true faith is not to obey the mandates of the Catholic Church. And by the way, this is also happening against our brothers from the evangelical and Protestant community by trying to force the appointment of pastors that are closer to the regime. I should say that organizations such as Puerta de la Montaña or Corner of Love, for example, which are Protestant organizations with an immense humanitarian work, are also persecuted through these tactics. So it's not only the Catholic Church.
In many ways, it's a mixture of old tactics while weaponizing religion and using forms of lawfare as well to repress these groups. Oleksandra, maybe you can give us your perspective on Ukraine. In some ways, I imagine it is a return to very 20th century techniques in some ways, but also what is new that you see afoot there?
I'm documenting war crimes in this war which Russia has launched against Ukraine. And while this war turns people into the numbers, we are returning people their names. Because people are not numbers. And life of each person matters. And among crimes which we documented, there are a lot of crimes on religious ground. We documented how Russians persecuted people for prayers and reading Bibles in certain places, which is not appropriate. How they transmit and transit house of worship into Russian military base. They remove all the crosses of the churches. I'm sorry for my emotions. Of course. They burned Bibles. They abducted the priest directly from the churchyard. They made coercion of priests to work with Russian security forces and to violate secrecy on confessions and more. So you are totally right. It's very old tactics. But what made this situation unique? Russia seeks to pretend to create an image of religious country that defend traditional values. This is not reality. Russia is negating freedom of religion as such. But Russian propaganda skillfully manipulating with the concept of religious freedom and hypocritically, Russia accusing others, especially Ukraine, of the very action it commits. And because Russia imposed enormous resources into informational war, people abroad started to lose their ability to distinguish between lie and truth.
And I think something we note right away is the use of storytelling and creation of narratives, which is crucial. And in the case of Russia, it's an identifying religion as a target because it is such a central pillar of Ukrainian society as well. I mean, they understand that if they are able to eliminate or obliterate this pillar, it will go a long way towards advancing their own militaristic agenda.
Religious means a lot for people in Ukraine. We are a religious country with different churches, different confessions, different religious organizations. And Russia is afraid of power of religion. That's why we document so many violations and religious persecutions in the occupied territories.
That's a very nice segue, Adrian, to the view of the CCP of Uyghurs and the work that you have done, maybe more so than anyone, of exposing. So much of what we know today is a byproduct of your own work, so maybe you can give a little bit of the perspective from your work and in China.
Yes, it's a great transition when my fellow speaker said that the regimes, and this very much includes the China and the CCP, they're afraid of religion because what they insist on is a totalitarianism. We cannot have any other competing loyalty or ideology. So China, of course, is by now well known for its brutal high-tech repression, particularly against the Uyghurs, where there's a genocide going on, but also generally against Muslims and Christians, using high-tech tools such as artificial intelligence to gather a lot of data to identify patterns of deviant behavior, or what's defined as deviant behavior. A lot more could be said about some of the specifics. We, at Victims of Communism, work very hard to expose these abuses. I'd be happy to answer your questions at our booth. But what I want to say is, China is not just using crude ruthlessness, and this is a general feature of 21st century dictatorship. There's a real combination of crude repression with very sophisticated next generation means. And what they try to do is not just to do overt repression, but to be much more insidious, using disinformation, discourage, distract, obfuscate. What we see domestically, China is using increasingly law, not the rule of law, but rule by law, such as the religion law from 2018. For example, confiscating the property of persons who host house church meetings, or forcing the so-called Sinicization of religion, saying religion has to adapt to so-called modern socialism, which even means a retranslation of parts of the Bible to make it compatible with CCP ideology. We see intense transnational repression targeting Chinese dissidents, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans. You might have heard of Chinese police stations in the United States. But a very interesting tactic, and that is taken out of the KGB playbook from the Cold War, is to create disunity and promote chaos and dissent in our countries, in the United States, in Europe. The CCP tries to use disinformation, and it uses Google, YouTube, Twitter, all kinds of social media outlets to promote extremist views on both sides, extreme far right, extreme far left, in order to break down the trust in our societies. And it very cleverly uses social media for that. Russia kind of went ahead. They're more sophisticated at it. The CCP is now following, and they have the numbers, and they're learning very quickly. They're adapting. It's kind of a form of 21st century information warfare.
I mean, the very technologies that we thought would have a leveling effect in sharing information and heightening people's awareness being turned against liberal democracies and groups that would have the temerity to stand up to these regimes. Each of you are involved in the very important work of pushing back against these efforts. Each of you, in your own way, have been part of this struggle. And so if we have a sense now of some aspects, some impressions of what these regimes are doing, I'd like to hear from you about what can be done in response. So maybe, Felix, going back to you, what have you witnessed or seen that you think has been perhaps particularly effective in the fight to combat this repression?
Well, under the repression, as we've seen in many parts of the world, and Nicaragua is not the exception, faith gets stronger. So despite the fact that 70% of the clergy in Nicaragua has been expelled, my own diocese has been run almost out of a priest in my own parish. But the people of faith in Nicaragua continue to fight through faith, and that's the same, I would say, around the world. However, they require international solidarity. So this resilient at the grassroots cannot be done without the international support of organizations that pay attention to this issue. Anything that we can do to support the mental health of those who defend freedom of religion, it's important. Underground networks, it's important. We have an underground church in Nicaragua right now. Decentralized leadership, so the lay are acquiring an important responsibility in this context. Also, reclaiming theology from the state. We cannot allow, as people of faith, that these dictatorships use of faith, something so sacred for the dignity of every person, to be used for propaganda. And we need to reclaim this independent theological thought, which I believe is important. Finally, transnational faith solidarity. It is not acceptable that one church is being persecuted, the leaders of other faiths remain quiet, because divide and conquer is their main tactic. And we need to show transnational faith solidarity and mobilize global public opinion.
I mean, that's so crucial because very much from the point of view of the regime, what it seeks is to atomicize society. It wants people to be divided and not have those bounds that cross age, social status, religion, what have you. And because to some degree, as long as people remain apathetic or only speak up for their own cause and not for others, then the regime succeeds. Oleksandra, can you give us a sense of sort of what you have seen that you think is most crucial in this fight?
Let's be clear. Religious leaders and parishioners in the occupied by Russian territories, they have no tool how to defend themselves. And they have only their faith, their own words, and their own position. In February these days, just a year ago, Russians abducted Father Stepan Podolchak, who was the head of the church, Christian church in occupied Kherson region. They abducted him from his home and took him away barefooted, with a bag over his head. And after 2 days, Russians told to his wife that Father Stepan Podolchak died. Russians tortured him to death only because he refused to transfer his church into Russian church, that is under total control of Russian state. He told, I can't break my oath. I can't break my congregation. So in this situation, which we have, I think that at least we must make these religious persecutions visible. The story must be told, and that's why it's so important to document these crimes, to make reports, to speak in international arena. Probably it can have a chilling effect to brutality of Russian violations in the occupied territories, and altogether we can save thousands and thousands of lives. I still believe that faith, own words, and opposition eventually not so little.
Thank you. Adrian, so much of your work too has been looking at the documentation of these crimes, but I'd be curious to hear from you in terms of what techniques, what avenues do you see for combating what we have witnessed and what you have helped us understand in China and Xinjiang in particular?
So I think one of the key things we're learning from the different struggles, and I think we've heard some of this from the other speakers here, is the need for determination, resilience, and a long sort of a stamina. And I think this plays out in two ways. Firstly, sometimes you can counter authoritarian regimes by letting them run their course. Why? Because over time, authoritarian regimes, the information situation gets poorer and poorer. Look at Putin's invasion of Ukraine based on terrible intelligence. Why? Because these people, Xi Jinping, Putin, and others, they surround themselves by yes men. Yes men who just say yes. They suppress accurate information. At the same time, those there who are suppressed experience suffering. Now, one of the properties of suffering is learning. You can learn in suffering if you have that attitude. And so I think countering the authoritarian playbook with their superior finances and technology, it's very much a question of the attitude that we have. And in that plays the need for solidarity. So we need to stick together. We can't just say, oh, I want freedom for my religious group. I'm a Christian. But we need to promote the freedom of all religious groups, of Muslims, of Jews, of Baha'i, of the many others who are represented here. And we need to engage on a technical level. What is important, we need good research, empirical data to provide informed advocacy and informed solutions for human rights advocacy. That's based on facts, that's based on good analysis, and that is fed to policymakers, to politicians, and to those in decision-making roles, to also give them the tools, how can I actually turn this into effective legislation?
Thank you. We're coming up short on time now, and our organizers were very disciplined in their instructions to us to remain on task. So I'll have one more question for each of you, and if you can be somewhat succinct in your response. I think it'd be very helpful for all of us here to end on a note of optimism. And I'm just curious that amidst all the things that you confront on a daily basis and in your work, what is it that gives you optimism right now?
Well, as a former political prisoner in extreme inhuman conditions, I can tell you that when you run out of water, out of food for even weeks, faith is the only thing you have. And I fought for a Bible. My wife was here, Berta Valle, launched the international campaign, a Bible for Felix. We turned that into an international campaign for every prisoner in the world to have their own Bible or their book of faith. So I will just invite you to not forget those political prisoners around the world for their faith. It's very important. The worst fear of a political prisoner is to be forgotten. So pray for them and support their families. And finally, religious people persecuted in exile. I'm stateless myself. 31 religious people in Nicaragua have been declared stateless. So a word for those in exile.
Thank you. Oleksandra.
I'm a human rights lawyer, and I'm applying the law to defend people, their freedom, and their human dignity. But now I'm in a situation when the law doesn't work. But I know from my own experience, when you can't rely on the legal instruments, you can still rely on people. And I also know that in many countries worldwide, people in this concrete moment are fighting for freedom of religion, are fighting for their human dignity. And very often, their efforts may to be seen no senseless because they fighting and opposing enormous opposing power. But the entire history of humankind convincingly proved that we haven't given up. We have to continue our fight. And what I want to deliver to this audience, that their fight, it's our fight. If we want to have freedom of religion, we have to fight for it globally. They need our prayers and our moral stand to act.
Adrian.
Dictators think that their greatest weapon is suffering and enacting a cost, a penalty for resistance. But I think it's actually their greatest weakness, because suffering grows our faith. It promotes faith. It gives us purpose and meaning in life. And it makes humans stand together. And I think that's what this summit is about. This summit is about solidarity. And that faith-based solidarity, I believe, can overcome any oppression.
I think I just want to end really echoing what Oleksandra just said about it being our fight. Because make no mistake, the dictators and tyrants see it as their fight. There's no mistake, there's no coincidence in the fact that the Ukrainian people are being attacked by Iranian drones, that they are fighting back and throwing back North Korean reinforcements on the front, and that the Russian military establishment is being bolstered by the Chinese defense establishment, all in service of a war, an illegitimate, unprovoked war launched by Vladimir Putin on the people of Ukraine. They see it as a global fight. They see it as a fight that they're in it together. We must do the same. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel this morning.